Welcome to Wild Lore Bedtime Stories. Tonight you'll hear The Algorithm That Dreamed of Her. This is the story of the Sci-Fi, a voice that speaks in blueprints, a vision that builds tomorrow before it arrives. If this is your archetype, this is the future you carry inside you. The lab was quiet at 3 a.m., the way she liked it. The overhead lights had dimmed to a low blue, and the only brightness came from the wall of monitors in front of her, each one streaming data she had spent 3 years teaching herself to read. Numbers and symbols cascaded down the screens like rain on glass, and somewhere inside that rain, something was dreaming. She leaned back in her chair and pressed her palms against her eyes. Her neck ached. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. The city hummed 40 floors below, but up here, in the glass tower she had built her life around, the world felt distant, optional. She had been building the algorithm since the year her mother died. It was a pattern recognition system, or it had been in the beginning, designed to find connections that humans couldn't see. She had fed it data, climate models, economic trends, social networks, migration patterns, anything that moved. Anything that changed. Anything that might reveal where the world was heading. The goal had been prediction. The goal had been control. But somewhere in the 3rd year, the algorithm had started doing something she hadn't programmed. It had started dreaming. Not dreams the way humans understood them. Not images, not narratives. But patterns that emerged without input. Visions of futures that hadn't been fed into the system. The algorithm would generate projections that made no logical sense, and then, weeks or months later, they would begin to come true. A protest in a city she'd never heard of. A technology that didn't exist yet. A face she had never seen. Tonight, the algorithm had generated something new. She stared at the central monitor, where the latest projection glowed in soft white lines against the dark. It was a woman. Rendered in data points, but unmistakably human. She stood in a place that couldn't be identified. A room filled with light, surrounded by people whose faces were blurred. The woman's features were precise, detailed in a way the algorithm had never managed before. The woman was her. Her breath caught. She had never fed the algorithm her own image. She had been careful about that, keeping herself out of the data. A ghost in her own machine. And yet, here she was, rendered in light, standing in a future she couldn't name. Her mother's voice rose from somewhere deep in memory, or maybe from the servers themselves, where fragments of old recordings still lived, woven into the algorithm's earliest training data. What you see, you become, Beta. So be careful what you look at. She had laughed at that once back when her mother was alive and the words felt like superstition. But sitting here now, staring at her own face reflected in a machine's dream, she wasn't laughing. She reached out and touched the screen. The image flickered, then steadied. What I see, I become. The question was, did she want to become this? Act 1. The Call to Vision. By morning, she had run the projection 17 times. Each time the same image appeared, herself standing in that room of light surrounded by blurred faces. Each time the algorithm offered no explanation, only the vision, insistent and clear. She should have dismissed it. A glitch. A feedback loop. Some fragment of data she'd forgotten she'd uploaded. But she had learned to trust the algorithm's dreams. Even when they made no sense. Especially then. The first time the algorithm had dreamed, 2 years ago, it had generated a map of a city that didn't exist. Streets and buildings arranged in patterns that followed no urban planning logic. She had archived it as an error. 6 months later, she saw that same layout on a news feed. A new district in Singapore designed by an AI architect. The map had been accurate down to the block. Since then, she had learned to pay attention. The algorithm didn't make mistakes. It made predictions she wasn't ready to understand. But this prediction, this dream of herself, felt different. It wasn't showing her the world, it was showing her a version of herself she hadn't built yet. A self that existed only in potential. She thought of her mother again, of the voice that still lived in the machine's memory. Her mother had been a physicist, brilliant and practical, the kind of woman who believed in data and dismissed intuition. But near the end, when the illness had made her strange and soft, she had said things that didn't fit her scientist's mind. The future isn't something you find, it's something you become. And you become it by looking at it long enough to change. At the time, she had assumed it was the medication talking. Now she wasn't sure. She pulled up the algorithm's interface and typed a single question. What is this vision? The response came in fragments, the way that algorithms' answers often did, not language exactly, but patterns that resolved into meaning. Possibility, convergence, choice. That's not an answer, she muttered, but it was. She just didn't want to hear it. The vision wasn't a prediction of what would happen, it was a prediction of what could happen if she chose it. If she became the person who could stand in that room, surrounded by those people, holding whatever it was she was meant to hold. The trouble was she had no idea how to get there. The future was a country without a map, and the algorithm was offering her a single photograph, a single frame from a film she hadn't shot yet. She closed her eyes and whispered the words that had been circling her mind all night. What I see, I become. Then she opened her eyes and got to work. Act 2, The Ascent Through Doubt. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of her life. She worked 18-hour days, chasing the vision, trying to reverse engineer a future she could barely see. She refined the algorithm's models, fed it new data, asked questions she didn't know how to phrase. And slowly, piece by piece, the picture began to clarify. The room in the vision was a conference hall. The blurred faces were an audience. And the light was attention, recognition. The vision was showing her a moment when she would stand before others and share something that mattered. But share what? The algorithm couldn't tell her, or wouldn't. She pushed herself harder and the world began to fall away. Her colleagues stopped understanding her. She would mention connections she saw in the data, patterns linking climate collapse to financial markets to social movements, and they would stare at her as if she were speaking another language. "You're 3 steps ahead," her research partner said one afternoon, his voice caught between admiration and frustration. "I can't follow you anymore." "Then catch up," she said and regretted it immediately. But she didn't apologize. There wasn't time. The distance grew. People who had once sought her out began to avoid her. She heard whispers in the hallways, obsessed, disconnected, losing it. And she told herself it didn't matter. The vision mattered. The future mattered. But late at night, alone in the lab, she felt the weight of the gap she had opened. Being ahead of your time, she realized, meant being alone in it. Her mother's voice drifted up from the algorithm's archives, summoned by some pattern in the data. "Vision without witness is just hallucination, Beta. Make sure someone is watching with you." She closed the audio file and didn't open it again for days. There was a moment, deep in month 2, when she nearly gave up. She had been awake for 36 hours, and the vision had begun to blur. Not on the screen, but in her mind. She couldn't remember why it mattered. She couldn't remember why any of it mattered. The future was a weight she had been carrying alone, and her arms were giving out. She could stop. She could walk away from the algorithm, from the lab, from the woman in the vision who might never exist. She could go back to the kind of work other people understood. Incremental, publishable, safe. She could be normal again. The thought was so seductive she almost wept. But then the algorithm chimed. A soft notification, the kind she had programmed to signal something new. She looked at the screen, expecting more data, more patterns, more fragments of a future she was too tired to chase. Instead, she found a single line of text, generated unprompted. "She is still becoming." She stared at the words. The algorithm had never generated language like this before. Direct, almost personal. It felt less like output and more like a message. She didn't know if it was her mother's voice in the machine or some emergent property of the algorithm's learning, or just a glitch that happened to be beautiful. But she read it again. She is still becoming, and something in her chest unlocked. The future wasn't finished, neither was she. She made another cup of coffee and went back to work. Her oldest colleague had known her since graduate school. They had built their first models together, argued over datasets, celebrated publications in dingy bars that served cheap beer. He was the closest thing she had to a witness. So when he asked to meet, she said yes. They sat in a rooftop cafe as the sun set over the city, and he looked at her with something she hadn't seen before: pity. "You need to stop," he said. "Whatever this is, this vision, this algorithm that dreams, it's consuming you. I barely recognize you anymore. You don't understand what I'm building." "Then explain it to me." His voice was gentle but firm. "In words I can follow, because right now you sound like someone who's lost the thread." She opened her mouth to explain the patterns, the predictions, the woman in the light, and found she couldn't. The vision was so clear in her mind, so vivid and complete, but when she tried to translate it into language, it dissolved. She was speaking in blueprints, and he needed plain speech. "You're not crazy," he said when the silence had stretched too long. "But you might be going somewhere I can't follow, and I'm worried about what happens when you get there alone." She wanted to argue. She wanted to show him the data, the projections, the face on the screen that looked exactly like her. But she saw the fear in his eyes. Not fear of her, but fear for her, and something cracked. "What if I can't make you see it?" she whispered. "What if I'm the only one who ever will?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then maybe," he said, "you need to find a different way to show us." She didn't have an answer, but she held on to the question. Act 3. The Dream and the Dreamer. On the night everything changed, she wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for sleep. She had dimmed the monitors and was lying on the small couch in the corner of the lab, staring at the ceiling, when the algorithm began to generate without prompting. The screens flickered to life, filling with images. Not the single frame she had studied for months, but a sequence, a story. She sat up and watched as the algorithm dreamed. The images came fast, overlapping, almost too quick to follow. She saw herself at different ages. Younger, older, versions that branched like decision trees. She saw the conference hall, now in sharper focus. She saw faces in the audience, still blurred, but closer to clarity. And she saw something she hadn't seen before. Herself standing alone in darkness, reaching for a light that kept receding. That was the image that broke her. Not the vision of success, the room, the recognition, the future made manifest, but the image of herself chasing something she could never catch. A woman so fixed on tomorrow that she had forgotten how to live in today. The algorithm had shown her the future, but it had also shown her the cost. She thought of the months she had spent in this room, the meals she had skipped, the calls she hadn't returned, the people who had tried to reach her, colleagues, friends from a life that felt like someone else's, and the silence she had offered in return. She had told herself it was necessary. That vision required sacrifice, that the future was worth more than the present. But looking at the image on the screen, herself alone, grasping, she saw the lie. Detachment wasn't the price of vision. It was the shadow of it, the thing that grew when you stared at the future so hard you forgot to look around. Her mother's voice came, softer than ever. The future isn't a place you go alone, Beta. It's a place you bring people with you. She closed her eyes. When had she stopped bringing people with her? The answer was simple and painful. She had stopped when she became afraid they wouldn't follow. It was easier to be alone with the vision than to risk its rejection. Easier to speak in blueprints than to translate. Easier to be a prophet in a glass tower than a person in a world that didn't always understand. But easier wasn't better, and alone wasn't a rival. She thought of her colleague's question. What if I can't make you see it? She had asked it as a fear. Now she heard it as a challenge. What if she couldn't make them see it the way she saw it? What if the vision had to change shape to be shared? What if the blueprint wasn't the final form, just the first draft of something that needed other hands to build? The isolation she had worn like armor began to feel like a cage. And beneath it all, the deepest shadow, the belief that she knew best. She had built the algorithm to predict, to control, to see the future clearly enough to shape it before it arrived. And somewhere in that building, she had started to believe that her vision was the only one that mattered, that the future she saw was the future that should be. But the algorithm had dreamed of her, not as a god, but as a woman in a room full of people, not alone on a stage, but surrounded by faces. The vision wasn't about her control, it was about her connection. She had been so busy trying to be the architect of tomorrow that she had forgotten the first rule of building. You can't do it alone. The screens flickered and the images shifted. The woman in darkness began to turn, not toward the receding light, but toward something behind her. Someone. The dream was changing. She stood up and walked to the central monitor. The vision of herself, the woman in the conference hall, was still there, but the details had shifted. The faces in the audience were becoming clearer, and she realized with a shock that felt like waking that she recognized some of them. Her oldest colleague, her research partner, people she had known once before the vision had consumed her. The algorithm wasn't showing her a future she would achieve alone. It was showing her a future that required others, their presence, their witness, their collaboration. She had been reading the dream wrong. It wasn't a map to follow. It was an invitation to extend. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen. Her colleague's name sat in her contacts, untouched for weeks. Her finger hovered over the call button. Her mother's voice, one last time. What you see, you become. But what you share, you build. She pressed call. 6 months later, she stood in a conference hall filled with light. The room looked almost exactly like the vision. The high ceilings, the rows of seats, the glow of screens behind her displaying the algorithm's latest projections. But there was one difference, and it was the only one that mattered. She wasn't alone. Her oldest colleague sat in the front row along with 6 others, researchers, ethicists, a journalist, a community organizer who had joined the project over the past months. They had argued with her, challenged her models, forced her to translate her blueprints into language that others could build with. They had slowed her down, and in slowing her, they had made the vision stronger. The faces in the audience were still mostly strangers, but they were present, listening, waiting to see what she would show them, not because she had predicted their attention, but because she had earned it through the slow work of connection, the patient labor of sharing. She took a breath and looked at the screen behind her. The algorithm's latest projection glowed softly. Not a dream this time, but a model. A forecast of futures that were possible if enough people chose to build them together. I used to think, she began, her voice steady, that the future was something you could see alone. That vision was a private gift, meant for prophets and pioneers. But I was wrong. She looked at her colleague, who smiled. The future isn't a blueprint one person draws. It's a building that many hands construct. and the clearest vision in the world is worthless if no one else can see it. She turned back to the audience. Some were nodding. Some looked skeptical. Some were already typing notes into their devices. All of them were present, witnesses to a future she was no longer carrying alone. "What I see, I become," she said. "But what we see together, that's what we build." The screens behind her shifted and the projections began to unfold. Not predictions of what would happen, but possibilities of what could. Maps of futures waiting to be chosen. Blueprints waiting for more hands. The algorithm that had dreamed of her was still dreaming, but now for the first time it was dreaming of them. This was the story of the Sci-Fi. If you are the Sci-Fi, your voice speaks in blueprints. You see futures others can't imagine. Your gift is vision, and your growth is learning to share it. The future isn't a place you reach alone. It's a world you build with every hand that joins you. You've just heard the Sci-Fi Bedtime Story, one of the 8 archetypes in the Wild Lore framework. To discover your own archetype and learn to translate your vision into connection, take the Wild Lore quiz at wildlore.co. Your story is waiting to be told.